Hello, educators. Welcome to our very first episode of Higher Ed Hot Takes. I am your host, Ashley Berry, and the CEO of the Higher Ed Institute. And today's episode is going to be specifically focused on breaking down the Heritage Foundation's document, Project 2025, and talking about the specific chapter that suggests the brand new administration should begin to dismantle piece by piece the Department of Education and what some of the implications of that might be, what some of the short and long-term consequences of not having a Department of Education are. But first, I wanted to go ahead and introduce our very special co-host, Dr. Joanna Schilling. Thank you for being on the show with us, Dr. Schilling. If you could give us some brief, give us a brief introduction about how long you've been working in education for and what some of your roles were.
Thank you, Ashley, and I'm honored to be on your podcast. I think this is a fantastic topic and one that, although is still very new and we're still trying to unpack exactly what it will mean, it's important for us to be thinking ahead about the ramifications. Mm-hmm. So I'm Joanna Schilling, and I am recently retired as a president of a community college in California. And before that, worked in administrative roles and faculty roles for about 18 years. It has really been one of the joys of my life working with community college students who are courageous and resilient and just unbelievable. So although I miss the students, I don't miss all of the administrative work that I was doing. But at the same time, I am staying involved. I'm currently the executive director for the chief instructional officers of the state. So I'm still involved in the important work that our community is doing in our community colleges. And before that, before I was a college administrator, I was actually in the theater world. So I missed that as well, but I found out that very quickly that my experience in the theater prepared me very well to be a college administrator and juggling lots of different things.
Thank you so much. And I was lucky enough to work under Dr. Joanna Schilling's administration, and she was amazing. So I'm very happy to have you on the show today. And I know that the role of president and VP and Dean really prepared you to talk about what some of these changes might look like going forward, should they happen. So we will just go ahead and get started. The first thing I really wanted us to discuss is to provide some context around how the DOE was started, right? So historically, from my understanding, public education was under the purview of local and state governments. And this was pretty much since the beginning of the United States, right? Since education started. And after reading a little bit of history, the federal government, the first big step the federal government took towards becoming involved in public education was after World War II. We had soldiers coming back from war who needed to go to college. And so the GI Bill was created, right, which gave them more or less access to public education on a national level. And then the second big move that the federal government did was they signed into law the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which had them overseeing, it essentially set the groundwork for all of the equity initiatives that we see today, right? It allowed more students of color to go to college, right? It stopped discriminatory practices in a lot of public educational institutions, right? Brown versus Board. It allowed more women to go to college. So there was a lot that came out of that, and it was largely due to the federal government and their oversight. And so when President Jimmy Carter, I believe it was President Jimmy Carter came in, he signed into law, I believe it was the Education Organization Act, something along those lines. And the DOE was solidified as an entity under the federal government officially in 1980. And do I have all of my facts aligned?
Pretty close, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm going to take it back even further. So there was actually a Department of Education in 1867. So it was post-Civil War.
Okay.
And there was almost immediately, there was pushback that this was a overreach of government because, as you explained, the education had solely been in local and state purview.
Mm-hmm.
So that was scaled back in 1873, I believe.
Okay.
And it became a department that really just did research and data to provide data of who was going to college, who was in school, local school districts. So it does have a long history in this country. As you said, after World War II, the Truman Doctrine in 1948, which did establish the GI Bill, also prioritized education as the cornerstone of democracy. So the idea coming out of World War II is the fear of communism, the fear that democracy would be in peril. And one of the important parts of this Truman Doctrine is that an educated citizenry was essential for democracy. Those words have always really resonated with me, and they're so important. And we need to continue to remember that as education is under attack, that education really is the cornerstone of democracy. So fast forward to the 1960s. So Lyndon Johnson, as part of the Civil Rights Act, started talking again about creating the Department of Education. So again, I want to emphasize it's again, not for the first time. And it was, as you articulated, to really focus on access to college that wasn't really granted to every citizen in the United States. On paper, yes, but in theory, yes, but in reality, no. So then you fast forward to the Carter administration, where the Department of Education really became an entity again. And it has been controversial ever since.
Yes.
So now we are 40 years into the future, and we're finding the same kinds of attacks against the Department of Education as existed previously in the 20th century and before that in the 19th century. So I don't think it's a coincidence that it's happening now, as many things that we believe are important for diversity, equity, inclusion are also under attack. They're related. They're not separate entities. But yes, so here we are in the discussion Project 2025 and the other state legislation as well as federal legislation is looking at dispersing the Department of Education and putting different aspects of it under other departments.
Right. And so just for our audience out there who is wondering, because when I first read the document, I couldn't understand why they would want to break apart the Department of Education, right? I feel like it's been such an important part of everything that we do in education. As an educator myself, working for almost 13 years, it's been pivotal, right? And so I wanted to understand what some of the criticisms of the more conservative right-wing populists were. And some of the things that I was reading about was there's this idea that there's federal overreach, right? And that I believe it's the 10th Amendment that says that education should be left up to the states. The fact that the federal government has been irresponsible with funding and the FAFSA, right? A lot of that has been disastrous because the federal government wasn't meant to be necessarily a lender. Some of the other things are the curriculum standards have not been as successful due to issues of equity, right? That some areas of the United States are more prepared to take on the standards of Common Core or whatever. And there's a lot more criticisms of the fact that the Department of Ed isn't doing what they should be doing. This emphasis on, DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism has made higher education sort of this this way to indoctrinate people into like liberal progressive ideas. So I wanted to get your take on some of what these criticisms are, and if they hold, your opinion, if they hold any weight.
Yeah. Well, so I think first it's really important for us to know what the Department of Education does, which currently they oversee civil rights,
Mm-hmm.
they oversee financial aid and access to financial aid to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
They also oversee equity and access, so the access to college,
Mm-hmm.
and they also oversee research and policy. Some of the criticisms are, as you mentioned, that it's bureaucratic, it's a bloated system. The funding doesn't actually go back to the students who need it,
Mm-hmm.
which would be a great argument. I don't think there would be anyone who would actually disagree that if we could streamline the process, financial aid is one of those things that's very complicated for students.
Mm-hmm.
If we could streamline the process, if that was the proposal, I think there would be a lot of support, not for dismantling the DOE, but to create a more streamlined system. But that isn't really what's being proposed.
Right.
And some things like Head Start program and access to free lunch program,
Mm-hmm.
which in the K-12s, that's something that you know very well.
Mm-hmm.
In the community colleges, we would have loved to have had access to free lunches for students in college, specifically our foster youth that you worked with,
Mm-hmm.
who suddenly are emancipated at age 18 as if they possibly have a lot of money to be able to spend on food, and yet food is such an incredibly important piece of being
Mm-hmm.
successful in education. So these are some of the really popular programs that would be cut or certainly diminished
Mm-hmm.
if the Department of Education was no longer. The other things are civil rights and being able to support disadvantaged students.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems with dismantling the Office of Civil Rights or putting it under the Department of Justice is that families who wanted to bring a case or felt that their child was being discriminated against would no longer have the resources to bring those cases. That's what the Office of Civil Rights does now. And if it was under the Department of Justice, that would be extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that also is very popular with the majority of Americans is the support for students with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
That's also something that is supported by the Office of Civil Rights under the Department of Education. And if you move that into another area, there's grave concern
Mm-hmm.
that these students would not be supported as they need to be. So
Right.
obviously those are the big thing that you also just mentioned is financial aid.
Mm-hmm.
And moving financial aid under the Department of Treasury and also under privatized support for running, dispersing loans, for
Mm-hmm.
example. That's already been tried with for-profit colleges to grave, what's the word I'm looking for? It has really hurt students who've come out with huge, huge loans because predatory lenders who are in it to make a profit,
Mm-hmm.
hence the word for-profit colleges,
Mm-hmm.
have no incentive to
Right.
have low interest rates for loans that they're providing to students.
Right.
So that's just the tip of the iceberg of the kinds of things. So why are there people in support of making these changes? I think it's very hard to come to any conclusion, but that access to education would be limited
Mm-hmm.
to the great majority of Americans who depend on education to actually change their lives and move them out of poverty.
100. Yes, I absolutely agree with you. So the other thing I was thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking about I'm thinking about, I used to work in extended opportunities programs and services, right, which we know serves a wide range of vulnerable populations. So foster youth, students of color, students with disabilities, low income students, students uh, who who are English as a second language learners. So I'm thinking about the first thing that pops into my mind that seems like a nightmare is compliance, right? There are so all of the things that we have to comply with as a program, and this goes for several programs on campus, is housed under one roof, the DOE, right? Even if it's in different offices like the Office of the Civil Rights or, the office that handles the FAFSA, right? Everything is streamlined because people are talking to each other within that office, right? There's a lot of communication going on between offices under the umbrella of the DOE. Now, I'm thinking about compliance because we had to comply with student confidentiality. We had to comply with FAFSA standards. We had to comply with accessibility. So one of the things that automatically pops in my head, financial aid required that for students to be eligible for EOPS for this particular program, they had to be taking a full load, right? Well, for accessibility purposes, students that got some kind of documented diagnosis through our disabled services office were allowed to take a reduced load because they couldn't handle a full load, and financial aid would still allow them to be in our office, right? We that was compliance, right? As long as they had something documented. Well, if FAFSA is now moving under the Department of the Treasury, and accessibility is now moving under Department of Human Health and Services, the communication between those two offices not going to be the same, right? And so as I think about all of the list of rules that we have to comply with, otherwise we get dinged, I think about the nightmare that it's going to be for administration to try to communicate with all of these different, the Department of the Interior, Department of Human Health and Services. Like, there's going to be a lot of contradictory messages coming our way. How might that play out in terms of,
Yeah. It's a great question. Again, going back to the purpose of this, if the purpose really, which is stated in Project 2025, is to remove administrative bloat, is to actually streamline and be more cost conscious, then this doesn't make a lot of sense. Dismantling it and putting each of these areas, still keeping the areas, but putting them in under different departments, to the logical mind seems contradictory in terms of actually streamlining the process for all the reasons that you noted.
Mm-hmm.
Just to share an anecdote, when my dissertation was studying boards and looking at regional boards that were locally elected in their region versus state-appointed boards, and I thought that perhaps state-appointed boards would streamline the process and make it a lot more simple. So I looked at actually the state of Colorado, which has in community colleges, they have half of their colleges were grandfathered, and they're locally appointed boards.
Right.
And the other half, which came after the 60s, they are state-appointed. And what actually I found in my research is that the state-appointed was just as political, certainly, as the local areas, but it was much easier for them to vote for cost cutting and to do things that they thought were helping students, but actually disadvantaged students because they were removed from actually seeing what students go through. They were well intended, but they didn't understand all of the ramifications. And I think that really illustrates the point you're trying to make, that if you disperse all these different departments into completely different departments, there is no really understanding the true impact that the decisions that you're making will have on students.
Right.
And your example about some students who need to take fewer units but are still committed. They might take a semester or a year longer to get through, but they're still committed. Why wouldn't they be still able to get financial aid? I think those are really, really important distinctions.
Mm-hmm.
And the devil is in the detail. I think one thing that we really have to emphasize about this plan is that it hasn't happened yet,
Mm-hmm.
and it would take a lot for it to happen. And what I mean by that is there's many different federal laws that are already in place that protect certain things that were within the umbrella of the DOE.
Mm-hmm.
Those would have to be, changed, rewritten, altered, voted by Congress. So there's a long way to go. But I sort of see this as this conversation that we're having is to illustrate some of the folly of doing this in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
but also being ready and aware
Mm-hmm.
if the worst should happen, you're ready to act and to defend the importance of the Department of Education in protecting students.
Well, and I love that you bring up being ready, because in my experience working in higher education, we are far more reactive than we are proactive. So I worry about this idea of being ready. And so to be fair, right? A lot of us have a lot on our plates, right? Working as a faculty now myself, like being on committees and having conversations, right? And I think people are just like, let me deal with what's right in front of my face right now. And we can do the what if later, like when the what if happens. So to be fair, like we work really hard in higher ed, and sometimes it's just hard to think about what ifs. But being ready is, I guess it's a relative term, right? So.
Well, we're here in Los Angeles, and we've just gone through several weeks of deadly fires. And the one thing that has come out with everyone is to have that go bag, right? Be ready, have that go bag ready to go. What are your priorities? What are you going to take with you if the worst should happen? And I think it's a really perfect metaphor, because we need to have our go bag ready.
Mm-hmm.
But that also means maybe we don't fight every single thing. We determine our priorities. And this is the opportunity we have to talk about this. What are our priorities?
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that we need to defend and spend our energy on, versus the whole 800 and plus, pages of Project 2025, which are all, the average person has not read all of those, myself included, just the key points that we're going to be really prioritizing. The other thing I want to emphasize about the funding for colleges specifically. So both for K-12 and for colleges, we don't get a lot of our budget or funding from the Department of Education. That's not in jeopardy. Special programs, we've already mentioned Head Start and the free lunch programs. Certainly at the college level, we have Title V grants that really help us to move initiatives forward. Those are important, but those aren't the things that we live and breathe on. Most of the funding still comes from the states and local funding. And in California, that's really true. Over 90% of the funding that we get is from from taxpayers. That's another area that is under attack, however, because there is certainly a conservative movement that all taxpayer funding that goes towards education in your individual state should give parents the right to send their child to any school that they want. So the voucher charter school programs. So that is a real movement in the K-12 specifically. It doesn't affect our colleges quite as much, but is definitely a movement in K-12 that you would have say in the curriculum that your child is taught, and that you would have a say in what school that your child goes to. Again, that sounds really great in theory, but the reality is what happens is those who already have money send their children to better schools with lower teacher ratios, and the students who are disadvantaged end up in the schools that nobody else wants to go to, and they have many more problems and challenges, which just makes the road
Right.
to get to college in the first place a higher hill to climb.
Right.
And my question is always, why would we want this? Why do we wouldn't we all be better off if we all had access to a fair education, a good education, and access to the advantages that an education leads to economically?
And
We would
it
all be living
benefits
in
the
a
whole
much better
country.
world. Yes.
Benefits the whole country
It
when you
does.
have an
It's very
educated.
short-sighted.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to go back to the idea of the FAFSA being moved under the Department of the Treasury. So essentially, what politicians have purported, right, or the Heritage Foundation in this document, is that the government has been irresponsible with FAFSA funding, and especially when it comes to loans, like that this is not our job, and so it should be given over to essentially a business. It should be a business venture. The problem with that, you mentioned predatory lending, right? Is that they can charge students whatever interest rate that they feel like, hike that interest rate when they feel like it, and eventually you have students that are graduating or maybe not graduating with piles and piles of debt. And we'll talk about debt in a minute too, but if we're handing over the keys to essentially to our future, to these predatory lenders and telling them, you handle it, we'll be guarantors, we'll make sure that the money is secured by the federal government, but we want to have literally no hands on it. How might this affect our students of color versus our more privileged students? How is that going to look equity-wise?
Well, I think first we have to talk about the whole premise, the idea that somehow a business person or business entity is going to be able to be better at facilitating loans than the government. The government isn't in the business to facilitate loans, but they are in the business to make sure that loans stay at a low interest rate. You can standardize that across the country. That students don't come out with so much debt that they can never pay it back. One of the things that's built into FAFSA is you only have a certain amount that you can actually access for the Pell Grants. Those are not just loans; those are grants.
Right.
So a student has to be conscious of spending the FAFSA, the grants that they get from the federal government. That's a good thing. There's no business that's going to prioritize that because they're a business, right? The priority of a business is to make money. So the premise is based on a faulty one, and it would absolutely have ramifications for students who depend on those loans. They don't have discretionary funding. Their families don't have discretionary funding to be able to offset those loans or those grants that they get. So if even just a little bit that either the interest rates went up or the grants were not available, or one of the things that seems to be a priority in Project 2025 is the repayment of loans. So that, I know, bothers lots of people, that somehow students are given grants that they no longer have to pay their loans. Well, this isn't just free money. I mean, technically, I guess it is. You can make that argument. But this is an investment in the future for individuals who could never afford to go to college without this. And most of the students, and you certainly know that, I know that from over 70% of the community college students in California, also they go part-time because they have to work. So even when they get support from the government, they don't have the money to put a roof over their head, drive a car to school, get a
Right.
bus voucher, buy their books, all of the things that cost money. It isn't just the tuition. So these things are essential if we're actually going to make an investment in the future of our citizens.
Right.
So again, that's the question that continually has to be asked. It isn't just students of color who are being supported.
Right.
It's students who are economically disadvantaged
Mhm.
of every race.
Right.
And
Right.
so this is just a red herring that we somehow want to focus on denying students the access to college, which is the lifeblood of our country.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. So I wanted to also talk about loan forgiveness because in several parts of this document, they are vehemently against any loan forgiveness programs. In fact, they're even against, so there's like a new SAVE program that Biden put in, and it kind of defers your loans and it stops all payments, or you have really, really low payments, like as low as like $1 or something like that. And then you are not collecting interest. And it kind of allows a lot of our students to catch their breath, work on saving, finding a good job. And they don't have to, with the cost of living going up, we know this over the past few years since COVID, it's shot up, right? With the cost of groceries, the cost of housing. And so it's allowed a lot of people to live comfortably, right? This idea that I can not only, maybe not necessarily make these payments or make really small payments depending on how much money I'm earning, but I also am getting credit towards the loan forgiveness program, which says you make 10 years of payments and then your debt is forgiven. So they want to get rid of that program completely. And the first thing that came to mind is when I was looking at some of the loan forgiveness programs, one of the big ones was working in the public sector. So for instance, one of the programs allows teachers who graduate with their degree to go and work in a low-income, underfunded school district and to be able to have their loans forgiven after a certain amount of time, right? So it incentivizes
Right.
folks to go into these like less resourced neighborhoods and still be able to offer, these children a quality education. And again, our most disadvantaged children, those who are low income, students of color, they have disabilities, they're foster youth, whatever the case may be. And so I feel like this is going to have a really big domino effect in terms of, first of all, the types of careers that folks are choosing, because we're already experiencing a really big drop in folks wanting to be teachers. That there is a deficit right now all across the United States. But just in the public sector in general, we know that those aren't the highest paying jobs, right? People do it because of the love for the work, right? And because of incentivized programs. So I just wanted to get your take on loan forgiveness and what it will look like if all of these people who are depending on loan forgiveness to kick in the next 5 or 6 years, all of a sudden have it sort of ripped from underneath their feet.
Right. Well, it would be disastrous. It would certainly change the vision that they have now for their future. And I think even more importantly, it would discourage a lot of people from going to college in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that the Heritage Foundation document does talk about is putting more emphasis on career technical programs, which are also programs that are part of and funded partly in community colleges, and students take out loans
Mm-hmm.
to go to those schools to learn trades.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not quite sure how you get there to fund vocational programs without continuing to fund all programs, especially in community colleges. But it would absolutely discourage people from the beginning. A lot of students who are economically disadvantaged are already worried about the cost of college because they don't even understand many of the programs that are available to them to pay for college.
Mm-hmm.
An example of that, I am a product. I am a second generation college student. And what that means is that my parents went to college, but they were the first in their family to go to college. And when my mother was going to college, she got a scholarship to go the first year of college.
Mm-hmm.
And her parents turned that scholarship down.
Mm-hmm.
And the principal of her high school said, I don't understand. Why wouldn't you want your daughter to go to college? And they said, well, we can't pay for the second and the third and the fourth year. So why would we let her go to the first year?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, we'll figure it out. We will figure this out together.
Right.
And that changed the trajectory of my life. So my parents went to college, which changed the trajectory of the children that they had, and then our children. So this is a generational change.
Right.
But the point of that is that we still have many, many parents who would say exactly the thing that my grandparents said,
Mm-hmm.
is that why are you wasting your money going to college? We can't afford this.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be staying home and helping your family or getting a job, and so you can get that first $12, 15 hour an hour job, and you might be still 40 years later working in that $12 or $14, $15 hour job. Maybe it's been changed for inflation. But the point I'm trying to make is that the literal access to education is based on feeling and understanding that it can be funded.
Mm-hmm.
And that when you come out, you're not shouldering the incredible loan debt that many of our citizens are shouldering now,
right.
because they took on too many loans. So that is my biggest fear. If FAFSA is changed and students are now at the mercy of whatever lender decides how much interest rates they're going to charge, or that there is a complete repayment for some people. This is based on your income ability to pay, what you were referring to before, that some are going to pay less than others. I don't see that as an unfairness. I see this as a level playing field, and I see it as equitable.
Right. Absolutely. So we've talked about we've talked about FAFSA, we've talked about loan forgiveness. One of the things that I read in the document as well is this idea that the federal government wants to assign block grants to each state that allows the state to create its own set of standards, right? So you get to decide what's taught in schools. You get to decide who gets however much money, depending on what local and state laws you pass. So I think the fear here, and I want to go back to the start of the DOE, was to kind of have this very this alignment of standards across the states, right? And this idea that everybody is getting what they need. And so, my fear is in some of the more conservative states or red states, right, where maybe funding doesn't 90% come from the government. Is the new standard going to be, if you don't have the 10 Commandments displayed in front of your California or in front of your community college or your high school, or if you're not teaching daily Bible session or whatever. And it's not just religion, right? There's lots of other things that we can talk about with curriculum. You're not going to get your piece of the pie, right? Or, so I know that a lot of times in K through 12, and I'm not sure if this is the same in college, but property taxes go towards education. They go towards the funding of education. So what if, in order to disadvantage our already disadvantaged populations, it's like, well, you have to, for every dollar that we provide, your property taxes has to match that or something. I mean, these are all what if scenarios, but I'm thinking about how much, again, going back to the equity gap, right? How much bigger that equity gap is going to get if states are left to their own devices to decide what the standards are for receiving this funding. Because right now, we all have to comply with DOE. We have to comply with their standards, whether that's curriculum or laws that are passed, civil rights, DEI, whatnot. So my question is, this fear that I have, and all of these are fears and concerns, how might this affect just access to education in general? Because if they decide, we don't like what you're teaching at your school because they're the dark secrets of American history past, and we don't want you talking about that, so we're taking funding away, right? How is this going to affect our students, their ability to be able to even get into college, or to finish their diploma, to get their diploma, right? I don't know if that was a clear question.
Well, I mean, I think you're thinking of all these things that are scenarios that could definitely happen. First, I want to emphasize that the curriculum in our states is very different. You know, we like to think we have certain standards that are met, but states already have a lot of power over the curriculum that's taught, specifically in our K-12s. You know, we've seen, you know, legislation in Florida, for example, of how they teach Black history or what is allowed to be taught, and so that's already a concern of how we enact education. One thing that I would say that, you know, why does this matter? Why should it matter to all of us? Is that, number one, we call ourselves the United States. We are a country that has artificial boundaries by state, right? Those are just laws that, boundaries that we have said that this is California and then this is Arizona. You step over this line, now you're in Arizona. And so the idea that different citizens would have different rights or learn different things in different states should be deeply concerning to all Americans, in my opinion. But it already happens in many ways. And the problem with that is that if we are a mobile country where you grow up in New York State, but then you move to North Carolina and you learn a whole different curriculum while you're in school there, that's a problem for you in both integration into community. It's a problem for you in your work. There's different standards, right, of knowledge. So that certainly should be a concern to everyone. But what you're talking about dollars is if it ever became such a thing that the federal government's going to give different funding to California than it gives to Mississippi versus Utah versus, you know, Michigan, based on either politics or what are taught in the classrooms, that is a big problem for everybody, and would definitely disadvantage students who are just geographically find themselves living in the wrong zone. We already have challenges for citizens who live in poverty from their health, the air they breathe, the water they drink. So now the education as well should be compromised because of the affordability of what the federal government is allowing the schools to have. That's a problem.
Okay. So the last thing
I don't know if I answered that question either.
Oh, no, you did. And it was, a lot of these are very what if, right?
Yes.
And so there's no perfect answer for any of them because we don't know what education is going to look like in the next 4 years. We can only surmise by looking at this document and thinking, these are the consequences that I see happening. It could be wildly different, right? But I think it's good to critically think about these issues because I'm one, I don't like being reactive. I like being proactive and understanding what we're getting ourselves into. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation. But the last question before we wrap up the conversation is, one of my biggest worries, and we touched upon this very briefly, is the move of the Office of the Civil Rights into the Department of Justice. And the reason for that is the Department of Justice has a whole agenda of things that they are already responsible for. And civil rights is one of them, but on more of a broad scale, right? Currently, the Office of the Civil Rights in the DOE they offer guidelines, they offer support, they offer oversight, right? When somebody feels as though their civil rights have been violated, they know where to go. They know where they can receive that support. But with the DOJ, somebody's civil rights would essentially have to be violated first, and then they would need to go and say, then they would ask the DOJ, based on whatever their standards are, this is what happened to me. Is this discrimination? And we know that part of what they're removing in, some of the verbiage in the Project 2025 is that they're removing this idea of disparate impact. So that can no longer be taken into account when deciding whether or not somebody's civil rights have been violated, right? And so I think my biggest concern is that if education is the cornerstone of democracy, right? And it is such an important part of getting people to understand what what type of, how do I phrase this? I'm trying to figure out how to phrase the question. So much of what we've learned about American history, about the inequities that we faced for all spectrum of disadvantaged folks, right, is through education, right? And now it's being moved under this giant umbrella that is the DOJ. How is this going to, I just feel like people are not going to feel safe and secure the way that we've been able to make them feel currently at our institutions. I don't know if that, if I really was able to articulate that well.
I think I understand the question, and it is a disconnect for sure, because the Department of Justice goes after they investigate criminal acts. Civil rights goes after people who are not supporting everyone equally. And you and I are familiar with that wonderful visual. Actually, there are several of them, but the one I really like about equity is showing, the kids looking over the fence at the baseball field. And the very short, little tiny one would never be able to see over the fence. He needs a very high little stool or box to stand on so he can see over. The very tall young man doesn't need a box and he can see over. And you basically give people boosts based on what they need. And I think that's such a great visual representation of what equity is and what the Office of Civil Rights does, is making sure that people have a level playing field and that they have access to the same rights as anybody. And when you talk about a merit-based system, that everyone should work hard and get there on their own, when people start at such different places, it isn't a merit-based system at all. Right. You're asking one person to do 20 times the work that another person does just from their birthright and where they were born and what kind of financial advantages they may have had. So that is the concern, that if the Office of Civil Rights is now really only looking at criminal investigations versus equitable investigations, there's a big difference between those two. So that is a concern. Again, the question has to be asked, why is this move happening? Why is it a better place for the Department of Justice? If the real end game is to get rid of the Office of Civil Rights entirely, well, then let's be honest about it.
It's a good way to do it.
But if it is to actually make things fair, then why are you moving it? What is wrong with it? And I think we know what's wrong with it, is that people are offended by this idea that you would support LGBTQ students the same way that you would support students who are not LGBTQ or don't identify in that way, or students with disability are the same as students without disabilities, or the reality is that's not how things work or how real life happens. And families who who need more support should get more support. And it doesn't take away this idea of a zero-sum game, that it takes away from me if you get more because you need more. It's based on need. I don't understand why that's a problem.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I love this conversation, especially because I, for one, when I heard about them breaking apart the DOE, it had me worried, right? Maybe a little too worried because, like you said, this would be a monumental task for the government to do, right? And maybe more trouble than it's worth. At least one can hope.
Yes.
So I wanted to give you the opportunity. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or talk about in terms of this document, or any encouraging words that you can give our audience?
Well, yes. So first of all, I really thank you for compelling me to do more reading and research on this, because I do think the unknown is the scariest part.
Mm.
And when you really dig down and read what is being proposed, it's really a political document. It's not a policy document. It doesn't actually. It tells you the what, but it doesn't tell you the how in any way. And the how is really important, and it's going to take a really long time. So to your point, the optimistic thing is that this hasn't happened yet, and it won't happen easily. It just won't. There's no executive order that can be written that just completely changes this overnight. It's not going to happen. But I really encourage your listeners to do your own research, both because I think it will calm you and make you feel a little bit like that you have control with some of the facts, which is what education is all about, right? But also that it arms you with the knowledge that if you do need to fight things and you do need to prioritize what really must be held on to and is sacred to our country, it will give you that ammunition to do that. So I really thank you for bringing this conversation forward and including me, because it was really helpful and educational for me as well, because I was feeling as nervous as you were.
Right.
And knowledge is power, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Joanna Schilling. And thank you so much to our listeners who tuned in today. We're so excited to have you here for our very first Higher Ed Hot Takes podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel at the Higher Ed Institute. We're so excited to have you, and we'll see you on our next episode. Thank you.